Hello, everyone, and welcome to Registrar Corp's webinar on current and upcoming FDA regulations for sunscreen products. My name is Clay Blondin, a marketing specialist at Registrar Corp, and today's moderator. The presentation will conclude with a live questions and answer session. If we run out of time, we are also happy to respond to your questions by email. You may submit a written question at any time during the webinar by using the Ask a Question feature in the top center of your webinar screen. A recorded copy of this presentation will be sent to all registrants. I'd like to introduce our speaker today. Anna Benavente holds a Bachelor of Science degree in biology from the College of William & Mary in Williamsburg, Virginia. Mrs. Benavente has over 10 years of analytical research experience. As a senior regulatory specialist at Registrar Corp, she has been assisting companies with US FDA regulations since 2009. She has researched thousands of products to determine whether they meet the FDA requirements for compliance. Mrs. Benavente is based at Registrar Corp's headquarters in Hampton, Virginia, where she manages a team of 15 regulatory specialists. I'd like to go ahead and begin. Anna?
Good morning. Thank you, Clay, for that lovely introduction. It's a pleasure to speak to you all today, and we're here to discuss a topic that has kind of hit the personal care product industry with a bit of a bang recently. FDA's recent actions related to OTC sunscreen drug products. So as part of the webinar today, these are the topics that we'll be discussing. We'll be providing a quick regulatory overview just so that everybody understands how drugs are regulated and permitted to be marketed by the FDA in the United States. And then we'll move into the proposed rule that was issued recently related to OTC sunscreen drug products. Also, the labeling changes that would occur under the proposed rule if finalized. The effective and compliance dates for the final monograph once issued. And then also about the Sunscreen Innovation Act, which is an alternative review process that does have quite a bit of ramifications on the sunscreen industry in terms of what will be allowed to be marketed once it reaches its conclusion as well. So we'll start with the regulatory overview. It's important to understand how FDA regulates products and the intended use of which can dictate the types of rules that will be put upon them. Cosmetics are defined by our Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act as articles intended to be rubbed, poured, sprinkled or sprayed on, introduced into, or otherwise applied to the human body for cleansing, beautifying, promoting attractiveness, or altering the appearance. It's important to understand that FDA considers cosmetic products to be those that make very superficial changes to the appearance. Products that don't may be classified as drugs, as drugs are defined by the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act as articles intended for use in the diagnosis, cure, mitigation, treatment, or prevention of disease in man or other animals, but importantly also articles other than food intended to affect the structure or any function of the body of man or other animals. So in this way, even a product that alters the appearance of the human body but does it in a way that affects structure or function can be regulated as a drug by the U.S. Food and Drug Administration, even if it's not directly treating a disease condition. So then why are sunscreens regulated as drugs? Many of you may be marketing products in the EU where sunscreen products are considered cosmetic. However, here in the United States, because these sunscreens and UV filters prevent sunburn, as well as decrease the risk of skin cancer by scattering radiation, FDA regulates them as drugs. This is because the requirements for marketing drugs in the United States is much more stringent than that for cosmetic. So FDA needs to have certain guardrails in place to ensure that these products do what they claim to do. Now, products that also serve a cosmetic function would be considered drug cosmetic products and would have to conform to the requirements for both cosmetics and drugs. And as I just mentioned, the drug requirements are much more stringent in the United States than those for cosmetics. So here would be an example On the left, you'll see a sunscreen spray, which is simply intended to provide protection from sunburn and decrease the risk of skin cancer. It doesn't make any sort of cosmetic claim about beautifying or cleansing or moisturizing, and so therefore it's considered a straight drug product. On the right, you'll see a sunscreen lipstick, which is considered a drug and a cosmetic because it beautifies as well as providing protection from UV radiation. Other common sunscreen combination products like this would be other forms of makeup, such as foundations. Now, in order to understand why the proposed rule that came out will have such an impact, it's important to know a little bit about how FDA regulates and permits drugs to come to market. So we have what is called the notice and comment rulemaking process. And for OTC drug products, this involves the publication of what are called drug monographs. A drug monograph is FDA's recognition that an active ingredient or a combination of active ingredients are generally recognized as safe and effective, GRASE. Products that fall within the monograph are deemed safe for marketing with no further review by FDA. So FDA does not review the actual individual products that are covered under the monograph, but simply dictates that a certain active ingredient in a certain concentration would be considered GRASE. So monographs are published to describe these conditions of use like a recipe book. So in essence, you match your active ingredients with the intended uses for which FDA says it's safe and effective, and provided it matches up, you can market it without any further review. So these are published for many pharmaceutical categories, notably sunscreens, of course. It's important also to understand that FDA expects industry to supply the data to determine whether an active ingredient is generally recognized as safe and effective. So the fact that an active ingredient is simply being marketed elsewhere in the world is not sufficient. FDA expects industry to supply data for them to draw their own conclusions regarding its safety and effectiveness. So as part of this process, then FDA also allows for public comment as well as the submission of data. And so hence the notice and comment rulemaking process unfolds in this way. So the timeline for this process can be quite lengthy. FDA usually will start by publishing an advance notice of proposed rulemaking. And in this way, they request data from the industry to determine what active ingredients are actually on the marketplace, as well as what sort of data can support that they are safe and effective for their intended use. Upon receipt of the data, as well as public comment, FDA can then issue a tentative final monograph, which is equivalent to a proposed rule, that then proposes the monograph conditions. Typically, a tentative final monograph will include those active ingredients that have data to show that they're safe and effective, the concentrations in which they're found to be safe and effective, and the intended uses for which they can be marketed. Usually at this point in time, FDA allows for further submission of data as well as public comment regarding its proposed rule. And the final step in the process would be when FDA issues a final monograph. So again, this is equivalent to a final rule, which definitively establishes the conditions under which OTC drugs can be marketed. So this would include the confirmed GRASE active ingredients, indications for use, and then also the labeling that FDA expects to accompany the product, notably the content of the drug facts chart that is found on all of our OTC drug products. Now, if an active ingredient is not in the monograph, generally that means that a new drug application or an abbreviated new drug application is required. And so this can involve lengthy and expensive processes involving generating supporting evidence, conducting clinical trials, the types of procedures that must be followed in order to generate the data to prove safety and effectiveness. The application itself requires a substantial fee to be paid for FDA and will result in the FDA approval for that specific drug product. So this is a pretty substantial difference in terms of the fee being paid, and that also FDA will approve an individual product rather than simply an active ingredient for a class of products. Now, the Sunscreen Monograph has had a somewhat tortured timeline. It's kind of a saga, a bit of a soap opera about bringing these products to market. There was a final monograph that was published in 1999, but it was challenged in the courts and stayed. So that means that it was not technically ever made effective. Now, because sunscreens, of course, are necessary to protect public health, they've been marketed under FDA's enforcement discretion, which has allowed for certain active ingredients and other conditions of marketing where FDA will permit the products to be marketed even though there's no monograph technically being effective. Now, while the monograph itself has been stayed, FDA did, as a separate process, finalize the labeling requirements. This all occurred in 2011, and they codified it separate in our Code of Federal Regulations in 201.327. Because a lot of the active ingredients that are used elsewhere in the world were not part of that 1999 monograph, and because of industry interest in having them considered, Congress passed the Sunscreen Innovation Act in 2014. They were also seeking ways to sort of speed up this process. And in it, it mandates the issuance of a final monograph for sunscreens 5 years from that date that it was passed. So that would bring us to November 26, 2019. It also provided for an alternate review process. We'll talk about that a little bit later. And also resulted then in FDA issuing the proposed rule that came out on February 26th of this year. This proposed rule dramatically alters the conditions of the 1999 final monograph that was stayed. So it's important for industry to understand what sort of changes may be coming based on this proposed rule that just came out. So the current enforcement discretion that FDA has allows for the following active ingredients, but please note that they cannot all be used in combination with each other. So FDA has individually deemed these generally recognized as safe and effective, but has only specified certain combinations. So it's important to understand that going in. But for right now, these are all singularly considered GRASE for use in sunscreens under the current enforcement discretion. The proposed rule has dramatically cut this because FDA only has data to support GRASE for two active ingredients, titanium dioxide and zinc oxide. As part of its review of the data that the agency currently holds, they also deemed two active ingredients not GRASE, aminobenzoic acid, also known as PABA, and trolamine salicylate. Now, in the proposed rule, FDA commented on its review of its current data, and they do state that this is not a conclusion that the rest are unsafe. However, time has passed, our understanding of sunscreens and how they work has changed. There are concerns about, for example, absorption data specifically, and FDA states that they need new data in order to ensure that the remainder of those active ingredients have GRASE status. Also of note, for quite a while, insect repellents and sunscreen products have been formulated into one singular product. FDA has been reviewing data along with the EPA because EPA is the agency that regulates insect repellents, and the proposed rule would deem these products to be not generally recognized as safe and effective. As part of the proposed rule and the enforcement discretion that preceded it, FDA has focused on the different dosage forms in which sunscreens are formulated. So the proposed rule would state that oils, lotions, creams, gels, butters, pastes, ointments, sticks, and sprays would all be considered acceptable dosage form. For sprays, they are subject to particle size restrictions under the proposed rule due to potential risks of unintended inhalation. powders, we're in a bit of a limbo leading up to this point. The proposed rule does include them and states that they will likely be subject to the same particle size restrictions as sprays. So for example, face powders that are quite common elsewhere in the world that are formulated with UV filters may be acceptable in the US market if this proposed rule goes through as it's written currently. The proposed rule also cites different dosage forms that will not be permitted. So this includes wipes, towelettes, body wash, as well as shampoo. There are going to be some changes to the SPF Declaration, the sun protection factor. The original final monograph from 1999 only allowed for a declaration up to 30 plus. Now in 2011, when the labeling regulations were codified, at that point in time, a proposed rule also came out proposing that the declaration be allowed up to 50 plus. The 2019 proposed rule allows for declarations up to 60 plus. However, it also stipulates a new requirement that the actual SPF value cannot exceed 80, which is pretty notable. If you look in the marketplace, there are a number of sunscreens that are marketed with SPF values that exceed this, 90 or 100. The new requirement would mean that those would need reformulation most likely because the SPF value cannot exceed 80. However, important to understand too that even if your actual SPF value is 80, it would still have to be labeled as 60 plus. Also of note, FDA is soliciting comments as to whether or not products that have an SPF of less than 15 should be permitted at all, or whether they will have to be phased out of the marketplace given concerns regarding public health and skin cancer. Other interesting parts of the proposed rule related to the SPF declaration, it establishes ranges for SPF values and states that the declared SPF value must be the lowest in that applicable range. And this is due to the testing procedures and the inherent variability that can be found in them. So for SPFs less than 15, it would be the actual value. For SPFs up to 29, you would go in increments of 5, and greater than 30 would be increments of 10. There's some interesting changes to FDA's policy towards broad spectrum as well. A lot of this is due to the fact that SPF values actually mostly reflect UVB rays, which causes sunburn, but not necessarily reflects the protection for UVA. So use of a non-broad spectrum product with high SPF values can result in excessive exposure to UVA rays. And that understandably is because there's no sunburn or discomfort to propose or to prompt a consumer to leave the sun. So FDA is proposing that all sunscreens greater than SPF 15 must pass the broad spectrum test. Current requirements mean that a broad spectrum SPF 30 product could actually result in less UVA protection than a broad spectrum SPF 15 product, which on the surface doesn't make much sense until you consider how UVA rays are scattered across the spectrum. So you can see this is an example from FDA's proposed rule that shows the range of UVB and then what's called UVA2 and UVA1 rays and their wavelength. And so what they're doing is they are proposing that a product meet a ratio of the UVA1 to the total UV absorption to ensure that the higher the SPF value, the higher the protection from UVA as well. So this is not actually replacing the current broad spectrum test because the ratio will be calculated from current test data. However, it will affect potentially the formulation of different products. FDA is also instituting some requirements in this proposed rule for final formulation testing as well as record keeping. So records of your required final formulation testing must be maintained for a year after the expiration date of the product. Now, because FDA has exemptions from expiration dating for certain types of dermatological products, in the case of sunscreen product that is exempt, records have to be kept for 3 years after the distribution of the last lot. And then these records are going to be subject to FDA inspection as well. So it's important to understand how your label might change based on this proposed rule if it is finalized. So because of the public health concerns related to UV radiation, a lot of the changes that FDA is proposing deal with making sure consumers have a good understanding of the nature of the product that they're buying and can make comparisons between products. So for example, the statement of identity, which is what identifies the product on the product labeling, has to appear on the principal display panel and include an alphabetical listing of the active ingredients, which previously was not required, the term sunscreen, and the dosage form as well. This has to appear in conjunction with the most prominent display of any proprietary name related to the product. It must be in boldface font and at least a quarter of the size of the most prominent printed matter on the principal display panel. The statement of identity must also be parallel to the base of the package, and the entirety of it must be in the same font style, size, and color with the same background color. So you would not be able to overemphasize certain aspects of the statement of identity. For example, you would not be able to have broad spectrum and a larger text size than, say, the sunscreen or the SPF value. Also important to understand that the statement of identity must be in continuous text with no intervening material. For the broad spectrum statement, there's no change to the current requirements for broad spectrum SPF, or the water resistant statements, but there is going to be a new requirement, again, if the proposed rule is finalized, for products that are less than SPF 15. And this will mandate an asterisk to follow that SPF value. It will direct a consumer to a statement that directs them to see the skin cancer and skin aging alert, which is currently found in the warning section of the drug facts label. The statement must also appear in the bottom 30% of the principal display panel in boldface type, 1/4 the size of the most prominent printed matter. So it's going to be pretty overt and a declaration that FDA wants consumers to see if a product is not meeting these requirements and will not be providing sufficient broad spectrum protection from UVA rays. The water resistant statement, FDA is proposing similar formatting requirements as well. Kind of noticed a pattern here with some of these proposed labeling statements: boldface type, 1/4 the size of the most prominent printed matter, parallel to the base, and a consistent font style, size, and color with no intervening material. Now, because sprays are applied in a different manner than most other types of sunscreen products due to their dosage form, there are special consideration as it's not applied by hand. Back in 2011, FDA asked for comment regarding the directions for sprays and whether they should prompt for you to rub the product into the skin, and whether there are any other special concerns related to this dosage form and the way that it's applied to the skin. So the proposed directions include special statements to minimize the unintentional inhalation, such as holding the container 4 to 6 inches from the skin and not applying it in windy conditions, but will not be proposing that the consumer needs to rub the product into the skin. Data showed that this didn't have any sort of effect, and so it wasn't included. Now, what they are proposing, though, are inclusion of flammability warnings. And these would be those that are in accordance with the testing methodology of the Consumer Product Safety Commission. And so FDA is defining these 3 categories for sprays specifically: extremely flammable, flammable, and combustible. A lot of sprays are formulated with ethyl alcohol as the propellant, and so hence the concern for flammability. Those that test as extremely flammable will be deemed not generally recognized as safe and effective, and therefore will not be able to be marketed. Those that are tested as flammable or combustible will have to include an extra warning directing consumers to keep it away from fire or flame. So when will all these changes be required? The proposed rule identifies the date of publication for the final rule as November 26, 2019. Again, this was the date that was mandated by the Sunscreen Innovation Act, and so FDA must adhere to it. Now, it's also important to understand that the final rule may be different than the proposed rule, and there's no way to know until publication. And this is due to the whole notice and comment rulemaking, where between now and then, the industry as well as the public can submit comments and data to FDA, which could alter the proposed rule upon its final publication. A compliance date is issued because FDA will not expect full compliance, of course, on the day that the final rule is issued. So generally, they don't expect it until a year after the effective date of the final rule. After that compliance date, no sunscreen product may be initially introduced or initially delivered for introduction into interstate commerce. And so products that are introduced into interstate commerce before that date can remain on the market. FDA will not be going into the local pharmacy and pulling them off the shelves or anything like that. But it's important for companies to make these changes in advance so that there isn't any sort of question about whether or not the products met this requirement. So we generally will recommend, once the final rule is issued, that companies quickly move to institute whatever changes are necessary into their product formulations or labeling. Now, the Sunscreen Innovation Act, while mandating that the final monograph be issued for sunscreens, also offered up an alternative review process. So when Congress enacted the Sunscreen Innovation Act, in part, it was to provide this alternate review process to evaluate the safety and effectiveness of over-the-counter sunscreen active ingredients. And so what it does is it supplements the standard time and extent, also known as TEA process, by which you used to be able to modify monographs that have been issued by the agency. Important to understand that the 2019 proposed rule that, as we noted, limits currently the active ingredients to just 2, does not actually address the active ingredients that are being reviewed under this separate process. Now, a standard TEA process involves an eligibility determination that an active ingredient has been marketed for a, quote, material time and material extent, and then issues a public call for data. The review of the data is submitted by a sponsor or any other interested parties, and then FDA's initial determination of the GRASE status of the active ingredient. And then generally the normal notice and comment rulemaking follows to amend or establish that monograph. Now, the alternative review process kind of speeds this up. Some of these monographs have been in the rulemaking process for years, even decades. It's not a very quick process. And so SIA requires that FDA make proposed and final GRASE determinations in the form of orders, rather than this cumbersome multi-step public rulemaking. And it establishes strict timelines that FDA must adhere to for administrative action. So what happens is FDA will issue a proposed order, which is the tentative determination on whether the active ingredient is GRASE, not GRASE and misbranded, or not GRASE and misbranded due to insufficient data. So in the case of C, they would expect industry to provide additional data to make a final determination. So then after the issuance of the proposed order, there's a 45-day period for public comment, and then the sponsor of the initial time and extent application may request a meeting with FDA within 30 days. And this is when the sponsor has the opportunity to inquire with FDA regarding what sort of data was lacking, things like that, what they can do to shore up the application to achieve success in getting the active ingredient added to the monograph. As it stands right now, FDA has issued proposed orders on 6 active ingredients. You may recognize many of these. They're quite commonly marketed in the European Union, for example. However, FDA found that they were not all GRASE, and they need additional data on all of these active ingredients in order to determine whether they will be considered safe and effective under FDA's rubric. In February of 2015, FDA issued a proposed order for these 2 additional active ingredients. As with the other 6, both of these will need additional data. At this time, there have been no final orders issued to add these to the monograph. So again, all of these need additional data. So what should industry do? Industry needs to submit data. It may be of help to coordinate with industry organizations such as the Personal Care Products Council, groups like that, to try and get data submitted so that FDA can make a positive determination for safety and effectiveness. Because if your product is formulated using any active ingredient other than titanium dioxide or zinc oxide, data is going to be necessary to ensure that either the final monograph or the final order classifies it as GRASE. So I hope this has been helpful. Registrar Corp offers many services related to the marketing of drugs in the United States. For example, we offer a label review and graphic revision service that will ensure that your product meets the drug labeling requirements that have been issued by FDA. OTC drug products are also required to have listings, and certain establishments must register with the U.S. Food and Drug Administration. We have many services related to these requirements as well. We will offer registration updates automatically as necessary. We also have assistance with drug master files and the DUNS, obtaining a DUNS number for your firm. And then should you require assistance with any sort of FDA hold or detention, we have services related to this as well and can help you ensure release of your products from FDA.
Thank you, Anna, for that great presentation. Again, I'd like to announce that we will be sending a recorded copy of this webinar and a PDF copy of the presentation to all registrants. We will now be taking questions and answers. You may submit a written question at any time using the Ask a Question feature in the top center of your webinar screen. Let's see. Okay, here's our first one. If we are using the active at monograph limit, however, there is no claim the product still is considered OTC. For an instance, dimethicone using it at 20%, but skin conditioning instead. Any protectant? Can you please advise?
Okay, certainly. So this goes back to the definition of cosmetic versus drug. And this question deals specifically with our skin protectant drug monograph and dimethicone, which is an active ingredient that is considered GRASE under that monograph. In the case of specifically the skin protectants, FDA does recognize that a lot of those active ingredients are also used in cosmetic products as well. So if you do not make a claim that the product is intended for use as a skin protectant, it can be used in a purely cosmetic product, provided that the claims and the intended use of that product conform to FDA's requirements for cosmetics.
Okay, second question. What is the process of submitting NDA and what is the timeline for the approval?
So the process for submitting the NDA, generally speaking, requires accumulation of data, significant amounts of data. It will vary quite widely depending on the nature of the drug product itself and the type of data that FDA is going to expect to support a safe and effective determination. So this type of process, generally you're talking about years upon years to get that individual product approved by FDA. Okay, so there's a question about testing for broad spectrum. And so the broad spectrum testing procedures are codified in our Code of Federal Regulations in Section 201-327. They're pretty extensive. The best advice that we can give regarding ensuring that your products are tested appropriately would be to find a testing lab that is familiar with these procedures, and then will also be able to verify that your product is being tested according to them, and frankly, guarantee it. If anybody would like a link into those testing procedures, we're happy to provide it. Simply contact us after the conclusion of the webinar, and we'll be happy to direct you to where you can find those procedures. Registrar Corp itself is not a testing laboratory, and so we're not able to comment specifically regarding the actual details of that testing, but are happy to provide what information we can. Okay, we have a question about the approved chemical UVA sun filters. So I know the information that we provided in our webinar was a lot kind of all at once. Right now, titanium dioxide and zinc oxide are the only ones that are proposed to be included in the final monograph unless additional data is submitted. So for example, avobenzone, which is a very commonly used UVA sun filter, is currently permitted to be marketed. However, if the proposed rule goes through as is and is published as the final rule in November, avobenzone would be removed from the marketplace. So again, all the more reason why industry needs to organize and get data submitted so that FDA can make safety and effectiveness determinations on all those other active ingredients that were not part of the proposed rule.
Okay, next question. Currently, sunscreen products with more than 2 active ingredients are offered for sale in the US. With final rule, is this not possible?
So the person who asked this question also asked about octinoxate, octisalate, titanium dioxide, for example. So the issue is that the final rule will also stipulate which combinations can be used. And because there are only 2 right now, titanium dioxide and zinc oxide, those would be the only 2 that could be used in combination. If you want to make sure that your products that contain octinoxate and octisalate, for example, can stay on the marketplace, data needs to be submitted. Industry, again, needs to really coordinate and make sure that the data is submitted so that they all are retained in the final rule when it's published. Okay, there's a question about where you can obtain the full GRASE list. And I'm presuming this means in relation to sunscreens. For right now, you can find the list of active ingredients that were covered under the 1999 monograph in our Code of Federal Regulation. They're noted that they are still stayed, but you can find them there. And it will stipulate, which actives can be used in combination with each other and the concentration ranges at which they've been found to be safe and effective. So that's where you want to go for now. There are also some enforcement policy documents that can be found on FDA's website that can provide guidance regarding which ones can be used and which ones can be used in combination with each other. This proposed rule, again, is just a proposed rule. For now, all the products containing avobenzone and octinoxate and all of those, for example, can still be marketed. The issue is whether this proposed rule that only lists titanium dioxide and zinc oxide is finalized as is. That's certainly something that seems like would not be advantageous to the sunscreen industry, and why data needs to be submitted to ensure that the other active ingredients that are currently permitted continue to be permitted after the issuance of the final rule and the final monograph. Okay, so there's another question about the increments regarding the SPF values, such as between 15 and 29. Because of the inherent variability of the testing procedures, FDA decided to establish these ranges. So for example, if you have an SPF 17 product, it would have to be labeled as SPF 15. They established the different increments. Probably I'm just guessing to sort of standardize a bit how these are declared, but then also to factor in the inherent variability and to make sure that a product does not accidentally overstate the SPF value of the final formulation. There's a question about SPF boosters and how they're differentiated from approved UV actives. I'm not quite familiar with the term SPF boosters, so if this person would like to go ahead and email some more specifics directly to us after the conclusion of the webinar, we'd be happy to provide what information we can. Anything that's considered a UV filter would be an active ingredient if it's performing the function of preventing sunburn or decreasing the possibility of skin cancer by protection from UV radiation.
Okay, we are out of time, but you can send us additional questions anytime by email to info@registrarcorp.com. This concludes our presentation, and thank you for joining us today.